Good season, disappointing season. I'm trying to weigh this out for the Washington Huskies in 2018. That's one of the reasons I bring in Chris Fetters, Dogman, 247 sports writer. Chris, how you doing today?
I'm doing great, Mark. How are you?
I'm doing just fine. Happy New Year. Hope your trip was a good one to Pasadena.
Yeah, it's always fun. Yeah, it was weird because obviously it's been 18 years. So, getting that shuttle ride from the media hotel to the Rose Bowl was fun and certainly brought back a lot of memories. And the day itself, I mean, especially if you're, for the neutral fan, if you're just living in Pasadena or Southern California and you're just a Rose Bowl fan, you go to that game. The pageantry of college football is on full display. It's to me, it's still the best bowl game out there. I don't necessarily consider the national championship game to be a bowl game per se, but as far as the traditional bowls, the New Year's Six bowls, I don't think the Rose Bowl can be beat as far as the history, the games that have been played there, and just the overall atmosphere. I think it brings out the best in college football, and I think we saw a great game on Tuesday.
Chris, we somewhat touched upon this in earlier conversations when Washington fell out of the national championship race. I know that this was the sentiment on the Ohio State side from the fan base, a large portion of the fan base. There were certainly some more reasonable folks that still embraced the season, a Big Ten championship, and everything that went beyond that with only one loss and a Rose Bowl championship. You would think that that's about as much as you can achieve without winning the national championship as possible. But the overwhelming sentiment I heard directly or on social media was, we went to the Rose Bowl and, this really doesn't count for much. Washington, the expectations were similar. Maybe they're not similar like year after year after year, but because of what Chris Peterson's accomplished, they were similar coming out of the gate. What was the response to the Washington fan base? Obviously, it was more of a slow decline throughout the season in regards to those kind of hopes. So maybe a different situation.
Yeah, I think to be honest with you, I think that there has been a ton of mixed reaction. I think first of all, on the surface, you look at a team that, won 10 games, won a Pac-12 championship, made it to the Rose Bowl. All these things can't be discounted. I mean, these are all things that if you are a Pac-12 football fan or a fan of a Pac-12 team, getting to the Pac-12 championship game, winning that game, and getting to the Rose Bowl at the very least, if not a playoff spot, is the aim. That is what you try to do every single season. And by that measure, Washington's season was successful. But their 4 losses were by a combined 15 points. And if you look at it that way, and you look at how fine the margins were, you look at what could have happened, in the red zone against Auburn to pull out. That could have been a very the game could have turned, and the result could have been very different. You look at pulling Jake Browning against California, and Jake Haener throwing a pick 6. If he keeps Jake Browning in the game, I'm fully convinced they win that game. It won't be pretty. It'll be one of the uglier wins that they would have had in a long time, but a win's a win. And then you look, they missed a 37-yard field goal at the end of regulation to beat Oregon at Oregon. They make that kick. Now, all of a sudden, those 3 win. You could be looking at an undefeated team. Now, all of a sudden, Washington's playing in a college football playoff semifinal. It's the margins were that thin. So I think there's a lot of people out there that are kind of in the camp of what could have been. This season had a lot of promise. Very rarely do you get a chance to have a team that has a 4-year starter at quarterback and running back. Myles Gaskin is now one of only 2 running backs in the entire history of college football to have 4 1,200-plus yard seasons, joining Ron Dane, which is ridiculous. You just don't see these kind of guys come along very often, so I think that a lot of Washington fans are very thankful that Washington's back where they need to be. They're back in Pasadena, back at the Rose Bowl again, back doing all those things they need to be doing to be on top of the Pac-12. But I think there's a lot of what could have been as well. I think they're and I don't know how there can't be. I mean, there's so many situations where you look at the season and so many opportunities that you feel were wasted.
Talking Washington football with Chris Fetters. He's a writer at 247 Sports platform for the Huskies, Dogman. So catch him right there. Chris, I think it's a great point in regards to the legacy of these guys. You mentioned Myles Gaskin. You referenced Jake Browning, not necessarily the prolific numbers throughout his career and what he was able to achieve in 53 starts. But I think there's a certain attachment that the fan base has to, depending on what happens from here on out. But if Chris Peterson continues to recruit and win, and this is the longstanding Pac-12 leader for, let's say, the next 10 to 12 years, that even though, and maybe they win a national championship, that the group, the core group that got them back to national relevancy and dominance in the Pac-12, there's a certain engagement or attachment from the fans that, hey, this was the group that got us back to that level.
I think there has to be, Mark. I think that there's no question about it. Whether you look at Jake Browning, whether you look at Myles Gaskin, whether you look at the offensive linemen, guys like Caleb McGarry and Nick Harris and Trey Adams, and then defensively, obviously, Greg Gaines right in the middle with Jalen Johnson. Then the linebackers, certainly with Ben Burke-Kirven, Tevis Bartlett, a guy like Benny Potoai, who's coming back, Ryan Bowman for sure. And then the secondary, I mean, they're going to lose almost every single secondary player after this year, except for probably Miles Bryant. Yeah, that's really the core of that group. And you really can't say enough about those guys because they really, really bought in to what Chris Peterson was selling right from the jump. Not just the football piece, but the entire culture piece as well. The OKG, the Built for Life, all these things where they needed to compete on and off the field. They bought lock, stock, and barrel. They bought into all of it, and it shows on the field. Chris Peterson is very much a process-oriented coach. He wants to make sure that they do things the right way, and they approach things the right way, and they continue to get better every single day. And they feel like if they follow that mantra, if they follow that belief, then the results will follow. And when you have 3 10-win-plus seasons in a row, you have 3 New Year's Six bowl games, a college playoff semifinal, and you're playing the likes of Alabama and Penn State and Ohio State in the postseason, I don't know how you can argue with the success there. Obviously, the final piece of that puzzle is winning one of those postseason games, and I think that's what frustrates Washington fans the most right now.
We're on the line with Chris Fetters talking Washington football. Chris is a writer for a 247 sports platform for Washington. Dogman. So the Rose Bowl game, yes. Obviously, the loss is the result, regardless of how it transpired. Some people might take away, I guess there's a few different ways to go, that Ohio State built a 28-3 lead. They seem to be the dominant team. And maybe Washington getting back in the game was just Ohio State getting lackadaisical, and there's still a big separation there. And we're not going to give a whole lot of credit to the comeback. Or it's, well, Washington finally hit its stride, played competitively. Look at what they were able to do. Oh, only if they had another drive. So I don't know which way you sit on that fence. I think it's probably some combination of both.
Yeah, absolutely, Mark. I think it's completely a combination of both. It's a tale of two halves, and it's the kind of cliched football thing that we see all the time, where guys get down early. Maybe the other team does mentally or psychologically feel like the game's won, so they let up their foot off the gas a little bit. Having watched the game again, my TV copy after getting home and watching it, I didn't necessarily see that. I'm not sure Urban Meyer would say that. I don't think a guy like Dwayne Haskins would say that. I don't think that's necessarily out of respect for the opponent. I just don't think they're built that way. When you look at a team like Ohio State and they were averaging 40, 45 points a game their last 3 or 4 games of the season, and the way they trucked Michigan, I just don't think that's in their DNA, to be honest. And of course, a lot of people may say, well, that's just because you want to give Washington credit. And well, I mean, in the end, it's still a 60-minute game. I mean, you have to play until the final whistle. I mean, that's the whole point. That's why it came down to an onside kick, that if Washington recovers that, now all of a sudden, they only have 42 some seconds to go, but you just never know what happens. And we've certainly seen greater comebacks for sure. I mean, you look at the Northwestern Utah game in the Holiday Bowl, and Utah was rolling, and then all of a sudden Northwestern comes back with 28 points in the third quarter. I mean, you play both halves. And so Yeah, at 28-3, I can certainly see where Ohio State fans wouldn't give Washington any credit at all. Fair enough. I get that. And so they're not going to give the comeback any credit, and they get the win, so they get to feel how they want to feel about it. But ultimately, if 5 years from now and you're looking at the statistics and you're looking at how things went, I mean, Washington ran 91 plays, Mark. I can't remember a time when Washington's ever run that many plays. They outgained Ohio State. They had a 100-yard rusher. They had a 300-yard passer. They did things. They did a lot of what they needed to do to win that game. They just didn't get off to any sort of start. And then I know you may want to talk a little bit about Taylor Rapp turning pro, but you look at that first touchdown to Paris Campbell from Dwayne Haskins. You look at the second touchdown from Haskins to Johnny Dixon. Both of those were in the vicinity of Brandon McKinney, the redshirt freshman, I think redshirt freshman, if I remember right, or true sophomore. I think he's true sophomore. The I should say second-year guy who was kind of tasked with taking Taylor Rapp's spot. And so if Rapp is in the game, do those things change? I mean, I'm not here to say that Ohio State doesn't score touchdowns on those drives anyway, but the fact that Rapp wasn't in there and Ohio State was smart enough and savvy enough and well coached enough to take advantage of those opportunities really speaks well of them. And then I think you got to look at that touchdown right at the end of halftime was a real backbreaker. And Washington, I actually asked Chris Peterson about this postgame, whether they had any intention of kind of running it out and running out the clock. They were down 10-3, I think, at that time, and 14-3 at that time. And, they were at their own 8-10 yard line, and they come out throwing the ball. And there's like a minute 15, minute 20 left. And a lot of people would say, hey, look, remember what happened in 2016 with Alabama. You're down 10-7, everything's cool. You go into halftime, regroup, but Jake Browning throws a pick six, and then the whole game kind of falls apart from there. History kind of repeated itself a little bit. And so with Jake Browning not being able to complete a third down slant that was right there and available to keep that drive going, they allowed Haskins some time to make things happen and score a late touchdown. They scored that touchdown with 12, 14 seconds left in half. Now all of a sudden Ohio State's rolling, Washington's reeling, and you don't know. It feels like it's going to fall apart. And then, of course, they go up 28-3. And now if you're a Washington fan, you feel like it's completely fallen apart. So, I see both sides of it, Mark. I think there's a lot of both to it in terms of, it felt like Penn State all over again, that Fiesta Bowl, when Penn State ran up that, what were they, had 28-7, something like that?
Yep.
So there was a lot of that to it. And Chris Peterson talked about the slow starts. He talked about how the offense, they're going to really take a long, hard look in the offseason about what they need to do to kind of fix some of those problems that don't allow them to get off on a competitive footing, because you can't get behind 28-3 against a team like Ohio State. It's just not going to work.
Yeah, I can't imagine trying to go through history, finding too many comebacks from 28-3 against a top 5 team in the nation. But to their credit, they got to the brink of completing the comeback. They needed one more break, and then they had the ball in their hands, albeit with not a lot of time. But still, you're at midfield with 40 seconds left. You've got 5 plays most likely, and you can possibly pull off a miracle against, again, at least a top 5 team in the country. Going to coaching situations, I think you know where I'm going to go. With about 4 minutes left, down 28-17 in their own end, facing a fourth, and I believe it was 8, Chris Peterson elected to punt.
Well, we asked him about it after the game, and he said that there was a fake on, and if that was also the one where they took a timeout, because I think they were looking to put a fake on, and they didn't get the right look from Ohio State, so they decided to go ahead and just kick it. So in the end, did it make a difference? I don't know, because if you don't make that and all of a sudden you give Ohio State a short field, now all of a sudden it could be what? It could be 35-17.
Yeah, the game's over.
And the game's over. So I see both sides of it, and at the time you're kind of wondering, okay, that's a give up, but did it really hurt them in the long run? I think that's one coaching decision made by Chris Peterson that I don't think ended up really hurting them all that much. I do feel them not converting on the third in the slant at the end of the first half to give Ohio State the ball back with about 65 seconds left and a relatively short field to work, just played right into Dwayne Haskins, into his hands and his abilities to throw the ball downfield. I think that, to me, not running out the clock, especially given the history of similar situation 2 years ago against Alabama, where they had almost the same kind of thing. They really had a chance to kind of regroup. Yeah, 14-3 is bad, but it's certainly not as bad as 21-3. And I just feel like that was a decision where, you know, and I give Peterson a lot of credit. He's a very typically a pretty aggressive guy. But in that case, I think maybe it would have been smarter, and obviously 2020 hindsight doesn't help.
For some of our younger fans, they're accustomed to the football strategy being what it is in regards to when to go for it on fourth down, how to use timeouts, when to give up on a half versus trying to go for it and making that judgment call based on your first down productivity and that sort of thing. You know, this is something that just in the last, I would say, 10 to 15 years has become completely revolutionized in regards to coaching and the advanced metrics that they have and probabilities in play that they know and have better judgment of what to do. But it's still, you know, back in, you know, even 15 or 20 years ago, if it was 4th and 2, coaches just, you punt. Unless you could quarterback sneak it or you were just so dominant along the line of scrimmage, you just punted until it was just obvious that you had to go for every fourth down because there were 5 minutes left in the game. But so, yeah, I find it fascinating because I believe that, and I watched this because I was watching the clock and thinking, okay, let's see if Chris Peterson's move pays off because, yeah, the game was going to be over because they were going to give the ball to Ohio State at like the 25-yard line unless there was a quick turnover. How much time are they going to give up? I think they lost about 1:10 because Ohio State kind of helped them out because they didn't pack it in and say, okay, we're just going to play clock management. They said, we're going to try to win the game and end the game. And they threw a couple passes. So that helped out Washington as well. I think they lost about 1:10 and maybe I'm sure they lost a timeout in there somewhere. They called a timeout.
Pretty sure they did call a timeout to determine whether or not they were thinking of gonna go for the fake before they punted the ball.
Yeah, and I think they also called one during.
They used a different punter than they had normally. Joel Whitford is their rugby-style punter who normally was punting up. Then on that particular one, they had Race Porter, who's their backup, who's also their main holder, who came in. And so I didn't know if perhaps that signaled to Ohio State that something was on. And so they may have not given them the look that Washington wanted. At least that was Chris Peterson's explanation after the game.